The steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound filling the opulent VIP suite of St. Jude's private hospital. Sophie lay there, exhausted, her body trembling from 12 hours of labor, waiting for the one person who swore to protect her. But when the heavy oak doors finally swung open, it wasn't comfort that walked in. It was a nightmare. Her husband, Preston, didn't come alone. He walked in with his arm around his assistant, Lydia, whose cold eyes gleamed with malice. Sophie tried to scream as Lydia reached not for a comforting cloth, but for the oxygen valve that was keeping Sophie and her baby stable. They thought she was weak. They thought her father was just a senile, poor old man who couldn't hurt a fly. They were dead wrong. They had just declared war on the most dangerous man they would ever meet. The pain came in waves, like a tide threatening to pull Sophie under. She gripped the cold metal railing of the hospital bed, her knuckles turning white. She was alone. The nurses had stepped out to prep for the final stages, leaving her in the dim, golden light of the most expensive delivery suite in the city. "Preston," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Where are you?" Her phone sat on the bedside table, silent. She had called him 10 times. He was the CEO of Caldwell & Co., a rising empire in the tech logistics world. He was busy, she knew that. He always told her that his work was for their future, for the family they were building. But today was the day. Their daughter was coming. Surely, a meeting couldn't be more important than this. The door clicked. Sophie's heart leaped. She turned her head, sweat plastering her dark hair to her forehead, expecting to see Preston's handsome, apologetic face. She expected him to rush to her side, kiss her hand, and tell her he loved her. Preston did walk in, but he wasn't rushing. And he wasn't sorry. He strolled into the room, wearing a bespoke navy suit, looking as if he had just stepped out of a boardroom victory. But what froze the blood in Sophie's veins was the woman walking beside him. Lydia. Lydia was Preston's executive assistant. She was tall, blonde, and strikingly beautiful in a sharp pencil skirt and silk blouse that cost more than Sophie's first car. Sophie had always tried to be nice to Lydia, even though the woman looked at her with thinly veiled contempt at company parties. "Preston?" Sophie managed to choke out, confusion clouding her pain. "What is she doing here? I need you." Preston stopped at the foot of the bed. He didn't look at Sophie's face. He looked at the monitor displaying the baby's heart rate. "You're so dramatic, Sophie," Preston said, his voice smooth and devoid of any warmth. "I brought Lydia because I have a dinner reservation in an hour. I needed to drop by and see if you were done yet. I have investors to meet." "Done yet?" Sophie gasped as a contraction seized her body. She cried out, arching her back. "Preston, the baby is coming! Get the doctor! Why are you talking about dinner?" Lydia chuckled. It was a dry, hollow sound. She walked around the side of the bed, her heels clicking ominously on the polished tile. She stopped right next to the machine, pumping oxygen into Sophie's nasal cannula. "She looks weak, Preston," Lydia said, tilting her head. "Are you sure she's strong enough to be the mother of your heir?" "She looks like a dying bird." "She's fine," Preston said, checking his Rolex, "just dragging it out for attention. She's always been needy. That's the problem with marrying a charity case. Her father is a gardener, for God's sake. She has no grit." Sophie's eyes widened. "Don't talk about my father like that. He's a good man." "Preston, please. I can't breathe well. The pain." "You can't breathe?" Lydia asked softly. She reached out a manicured hand and rested it on the flow valve of the oxygen tank. "You know, Preston, if something happened, complications are common in childbirth, aren't they? Especially with women of, weaker stock. Preston looked at Lydia, then at Sophie. For a second, Sophie thought he would yell at Lydia to step away. Instead, he just shrugged. "If she doesn't make it, the prenup is void," Preston muttered, almost to himself. "I keep everything. And I get the baby." "No," Sophie whispered, terror piercing through the fog of labor. "What are you saying?" Lydia smiled. "He's saying, honey, that you're expired goods." With a sharp, deliberate twist, Lydia turned the valve. The hiss of the oxygen stopped. Sophie gasped, her lungs suddenly fighting for air that wasn't there. The panic set in instantly. The room started to spin. The contraction peaked, and without the oxygen, the pain became blinding. The heart monitor's rhythm began to speed up, erratic and angry. Beep, 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 beep. "Preston!" Sophie screamed, but it came out as a wheeze. "Help me!" Preston didn't move. He just watched, a look of morbid curiosity on his face. "Let's go, Lydia. The nurses will be back in 5 minutes. Nature takes its course." "Bye, Sophie," Lydia whispered, leaning down to Sophie's ear. "Don't worry. I'll be a great mother to your child." They turned and walked out. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing Sophie in with the silence and the suffocating darkness. The panic button. Sophie knew she had to reach it. It was dangling on a red cord near the pillow, but in her thrashing, it had slipped down the side of the bed. Her vision was tunneling. Black spots danced before her eyes. Her baby. She had to save her baby. With the last ounce of her strength, she threw her arm over the side of the bed, her fingers brushing the plastic button. She couldn't grip it. She slammed her hand against the side rail, making a loud clang, then another. Crash. She knocked the water pitcher off the table. It shattered. Moments later, or perhaps hours, time was melting away. The door burst open. "Mrs. Caldwell!" It was Nurse Jenny. She rushed to the bedside, her eyes widening when she saw the oxygen valve turned to off, and Sophie's blue lips. "Code Blue! I need help in 402. Get the attending now." The room flooded with people. White coats, urgent voices, the tearing of Velcro, the sharp prick of needles. Sophie felt herself drifting away. The last thing she saw was the ceiling tiles, blurring into a white abyss. "I'm sorry, Dad," she thought. "I chose the wrong man." 2 hours later, the waiting room of St. Jude's was quiet. It was a VIP waiting room, filled with leather armchairs, fresh espresso machines, and abstract art. Sitting in the corner, clutching a worn-out newsboy cap, was an old man. He wore a faded flannel shirt, trousers that had been patched at the knee, and heavy work boots that had seen decades of mud. His hands were calloused and rough, the hands of a man who worked the earth. This was Winston, Sophie's father. He sat perfectly still, staring at the floor. The double doors swung open. Dr. Ares, the head obstetrician, walked out. He looked tired. Winston stood up immediately. He didn't rush, but his presence filled the room despite his ragged clothes. "My daughter?" he asked. His voice was gravelly and low. Dr. Ares sighed, adjusting his glasses. He looked at Winston with a hint of pity. He knew who the husband was, Preston Caldwell, the billionaire tech mogul, and he assumed this old man was just the poor father-in-law who had lucked into a rich family. "Mr. Mercer, is it?" Dr. Ares asked. "Yes. How is Sophie?" "She is stable," the doctor said, choosing his words carefully. But it was a very close call. There was an incident with her oxygen supply. She suffered severe hypoxia. She is currently in a medically induced coma to allow her brain to heal. We delivered the baby via an emergency C-section. A girl. Winston's eyes, usually warm and crinkled with smile lines, went cold. Oxygen supply? Was the equipment faulty? Dr. Harris hesitated. He had been paid a visit by Preston Caldwell just 10 minutes ago. A substantial donation to the hospital wing had been mentioned, a reminder of who paid the bills. Equipment malfunction, Dr. Harris lied, looking at his clipboard. It happens. We are investigating. But, frankly, Mr. Mercer, your daughter's constitution was weak. The stress of the labor. Where is her husband? Winston cut him off. Mr. Caldwell was distressed. The doctor lied again. He had to leave to handle urgent business to pay for these treatments. He left instructions that you are not to disturb the baby in the NICU. Winston didn't yell. He didn't cry. He slowly put his cap back on his head. I see, Winston said. Can I see my daughter? Briefly. She won't hear you. Winston walked past the doctor, his heavy boots thumping softly on the carpet. He entered the ICU room where Sophie lay, hooked up to a dozen machines. She looked so small. Winston walked to her side and took her limp hand in his rough, scarred palm. I told you he was a snake, Soph, Winston whispered, his voice trembling for the first time. But I let you marry him because you loved him. I stepped back. I played the poor gardener because you wanted a normal life. You didn't want my shadow over you. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. But the shadow is coming back now. Winston pulled a cheap-looking flip phone from his pocket. It was an old model, taped together at the hinge. To anyone watching, it looked like a piece of junk. He dialed a number. Yes? A voice answered on the other end. Sharp, British, efficient. It's me, Winston said. The tremble was gone from his voice. It was replaced by a tone of command that could level buildings. Activate the ghost protocol. Sir? The voice on the phone sounded shocked. We haven't used that since the 98 merger wars. Are you sure? That means total scorched earth. My daughter is in a coma. They cut her oxygen, Winston said, his eyes fixed on Sophie's pale face. I want Preston Caldwell destroyed, not just broke. I want him erased. I want him to lose his company, his reputation, his mistress, and his freedom. And I want it to happen slowly. Understood, sir. What is your first order? Winston looked at his reflection in the hospital window. He didn't look like a gardener anymore. By the hospital, Winston said. Right now. I want to own the ground he's standing on when he comes back. Consider it done, Mr. Mercer. Winston hung up the phone. He sat down in the chair next to Sophie's bed and waited. The gardener was gone. The Titan had returned. The champagne cork popped with a festive sound in the high-rise penthouse overlooking the city skyline. Preston Caldwell laughed, throwing his head back as he caught the frothy liquid in a crystal flute. Lydia was draped across the velvet sofa, scrolling through her phone, a satisfied smirk on her red lips. To freedom, Preston toasted, raising his glass. To the future, Lydia corrected, clinking her glass against his. So did the old man buy it? The equipment malfunction story? Preston scoffed, taking a sip. Winston? Please, the man barely knows what day it is. He's probably crying into his potting soil right now. He's powerless. He doesn't have the money to hire a lawyer, let alone challenge me. And the wife? Lydia asked, casually examining her nails. Coma, Preston said, waving his hand dismissively. Dr. Harris said she might not wake up, and if she does, she'll likely have brain damage. She won't remember a thing about the valve. We're in the clear, Lyd. And the best part? Since she's incapacitated, I have power of attorney. I control her assets, which are nothing, but more importantly, I have full custody of the kid. Ugh, the kid! Lydia wrinkled her nose. Do we have to keep it? It's going to be noisy. Nannies, Preston said. We'll hire 3. You won't even know it's there. But the kid is a prop, A grieving single father devoted to his daughter? The press will eat it up. My stock prices will soar. Preston walked to the window, looking down at the city lights. He felt invincible. He had just gotten rid of a boring wife, kept his fortune, and upgraded to a hotter, more ambitious partner. "By the way," Preston said, turning back to Lydia, "I have a board meeting tomorrow. We're finally closing the deal with the Omega Group. Once that signs, I'll be a billionaire. Officially." Sexy," Lydia purred. Just then, Preston's phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. "Who is this?" he answered, annoyed. "Mr. Caldwell?" A calm, administrative voice spoke. "This is the hospital administration at St. Jude's." "I already spoke to Eris. I sent the check. What do you want?" "There has been a change in management, Mr. Caldwell. The hospital has been acquired by a private holding company as of 10 minutes ago." Preston frowned. "So what? That doesn't concern me." "It does, actually. The new ownership has ordered a full audit of all security footage and equipment logs regarding the incident in Suite 402, and they have revoked your VIP privileges. You are banned from the premises effective immediately." "Excuse me." Preston laughed, incredulous. "Do you know who I am? I practically funded your maternity wing. Who is this new owner? I want to speak to him." "The owner prefers to remain anonymous, Mr. Caldwell, but he left a message for you." "What message?" Preston snapped. "The message is, weeds are pulled out by the root." The line went dead. Preston stared at the phone. "What the hell?" "What's wrong?" Lydia asked, sitting up. "Some bureaucratic nonsense at the hospital," Preston muttered, shaking off the sudden chill that had run down his spine. "Someone bought the place, probably some private equity firm trying to flex. Weeds are pulled out by the root. Sounds like some fortune cookie garbage." He poured another glass of champagne. "Forget it. Tomorrow is the Omega deal. After that, I'll buy the damn hospital myself and fire everyone." Little did Preston know, the Omega Group was a shell company, and the man sitting at the head of the table for the Omega Group wasn't a stranger. It was the gardener. The boardroom of Caldwell & Co. was a fortress of glass and steel, suspended 50 floors above the city. It smelled of espresso, expensive leather, and fear. Preston stood at the head of the long mahogany table, a laser pointer in his hand. Behind him, a projection screen displayed a graph with a line shooting upward like a rocket. "Gentlemen," Preston said, his voice booming with confidence, "and ladies." He nodded to Lydia, who sat to his right, scribbling notes on an iPad, looking every bit the dutiful executive assistant while shooting him secret, flirtatious glances. "Today marks the beginning of a new era," Preston continued. "The Omega Group has agreed to an infusion of $200 million. This capital will not only save our logistics division, but will crush our competitors. We signed the papers at 10 a.m. He checked his Rolex. It was 9:58 a.m. The board members, a group of grey-haired men and women in dark suits, nodded approvingly. They had been worried about the company's recent cash flow problems Preston had carefully hidden with creative accounting, but this deal would fix everything. "Who is the representative for Omega?" asked Mr. Henderson, the CFO, a nervous man with a comb-over. "We've dealt entirely through intermediaries. It's unusual." "Does it matter?" Preston scoffed. "Money is money, Henderson. They're probably sending some lawyer in a cheap suit to sign the dotted line." At exactly 10 a.m., the heavy double doors at the far end of the room didn't just open, they were pushed wide by two hulking men in black suits. They weren't building security. They looked like private military contractors. Preston frowned. "What is this? Who are you?" The guard stepped aside. A man walked in. The silence in the room was absolute. It was Winston. But it wasn't the Winston that Preston knew. Gone were the patched trousers, the flannel shirt, and the dirt-stained boots. Gone was the stooped posture of the humble gardener who brought vegetables to Preston's back door on Sundays. This Winston stood 6'2", his back ramrod straight. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit that whispered of Savile Row tailoring, the kind of suit that cost more than most people earned in a year. A platinum watch glinted on his wrist, and his silver hair was combed back, revealing a face that looked like it was carved from granite. He didn't look like a gardener. He looked like an emperor. Behind him trailed a phalanx of 6 lawyers, all carrying briefcases. Preston blinked, his brain struggling to process the image. He let out a confused, nervous laugh. "Winston?" Preston asked, dropping his laser pointer on the table. "What the hell are you doing here? Did you get lost looking for the service elevator?" Lydia looked up, her eyes widening. "Is that the dad? Why is he dressed like that?" Winston didn't answer. He didn't even look at Preston. He walked calmly toward the head of the table. The board members, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure, instinctively pulled their chairs back. "Security!" Preston shouted, his face reddening. "Get this man out of here. He's trespassing. He's my father-in-law. He's senile and grief-stricken." One of the security guards from the lobby appeared in the doorway, looking breathless. "Mr. Caldwell, I tried to stop them, but—" "But what?" Preston screamed. "But he owns the building, sir," the guard stammered. The room went dead silent. Preston froze. "Excuse me?" Winston finally stopped. He stood at the opposite end of the table, facing Preston directly. He placed his hands on the mahogany surface and leaned forward. The warmth was gone from his eyes, replaced by a glacial blue stare that terrified Mr. Henderson. "I don't own the building, Preston," Winston said. His voice was different, too. The gravelly country accent was polished into the crisp, articulate tone of the old money elite. "I own the block, and as of this morning, I am the Omega Group." "You?" Preston laughed, though it sounded hysterical now. "You're a gardener. You grow tomatoes. You live in a shack." "I retired," Winston said calmly. "I wanted a simple life for my daughter. I wanted to see if she could find a man who loved her for her heart, not her inheritance. I played the pauper to test you, Preston." Winston reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a fountain pen. "You failed the test." Preston's hands started to shake. "This is a joke. Sophie hired actors. That's it. Sophie is in a coma because of you." Winston's voice dropped an octave, vibrating with suppressed rage. "And because of her." He didn't look at Lydia, but he pointed a finger at her that felt like a loaded gun. Lydia shrank back in her chair. "Mr. Mercer," one of Winston's lawyers stepped forward, placing a thick stack of documents on the table. "Shall we proceed?" "Proceed with what?" Preston demanded. "We have a deal. Omega promised 200 million. "Correction," Winston said. "Omega purchased your debt. We bought the loans from your banks this morning, all of them. The construction loans, the logistics fleet financing, the personal loans you took out against your stock." Winston picked up the document and threw it down the length of the table. It slid perfectly, stopping right in front of Preston. "It's a debt call, Preston, due immediately." "You can't do that," Preston shouted. "The terms allow for—" "Read Clause 14b, the lawyer interrupted. "The moral turpitude clause. If the CEO is involved in a scandal that threatens the company's integrity, the lender has the right to demand immediate repayment." "I haven't been involved in a scandal," Preston argued. Winston pulled out a remote control and pointed it at the projection screen. "Not yet," Winston said. but the news goes live in 5 minutes." On the screen, the graph disappeared. It was replaced by a video feed. It was grainy, black and white footage. It was the interior of Hospital Suite 402. Preston's face went white. Lydia gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "The hospital has cameras, Preston," Winston said coldly. "Hidden ones for liability. And guess what they recorded?" The video played. There was no audio, but the image was crystal clear. It showed Lydia reaching for the oxygen valve. It showed Preston checking his watch, indifferent. It showed them walking out while Sophie thrashed on the bed. The board members gasped. Mr. Henderson looked like he was going to be sick. "Attempted murder," Winston said. "Conspiracy. Gross negligence." That's fake," Lydia shrieked, standing up. "That's AI. He made it up." "The metadata has already been verified by the police," Winston said. "They are in the lobby, waiting for the elevator. But I wanted to see the look on your face before they put the cuffs on you." Preston looked at the screen, then at Winston, then at the window. He looked like a trapped rat. "Winston, wait," Preston stammered, holding up his hands. "We can work this out. Think about the baby. Think about your granddaughter. You don't want her father in prison." "My granddaughter," Winston said, walking slowly around the table toward Preston, "has a father. Me. You are just the sperm donor who tried to kill her mother." Winston stopped inches from Preston's face. He smelled of expensive cologne and cold vengeance. "I'm taking the company, Preston. The debt call will bankrupt it. I'll buy the scraps for pennies on the dollar. You will leave this building with nothing. No stock. No golden parachute. No dignity. You can't prove I knew what she was doing." Preston pointed at Lydia. "It was her. She's crazy. She turned the valve. I didn't see it." Lydia's jaw dropped. "You coward. You told me to do it. You said, if she dies, the prenup is void. I never said that." "You did." Lydia lunged at him, clawing at his face. "You set me up." The board members watched in horror as the CEO and his assistant brawled like children. "Gentlemen," Winston said to the board, turning his back on the chaos, "I suggest you resign immediately if you want to save your own reputations. Anyone still on the board in 10 minutes will be named as a co-conspirator in the cover-up lawsuit." Chairs scraped against the floor. It was a stampede. The board members grabbed their briefcases and fled, leaving Preston and Lydia alone with Winston and his guards. The elevator chimed. 2 police officers walked in, followed by a detective. "Preston Caldwell? Lydia Vance?" the detective asked. Preston straightened his tie, his face scratched and bleeding from Lydia's nails. "Officer, thank God. This man is harassing me. He's trespassing." The detective ignored him. He looked at Winston and nodded respectfully. "Mr. Mercer, we have the warrant." "Take them," Winston said, turning away to look out the window at the city he practically owned. "You're making a mistake," Preston screamed as the officer slammed him against the table and cuffed his hands behind his back. "I'm a CEO. I'm a billionaire." "You're broke, Preston," Winston said, without turning around. "Check your phone." Preston couldn't check his phone. His hands were cuffed, but he heard the notifications pinging incessantly in his pocket. Ping, ping, ping. Alerts of stock plummeting. Margin calls, assets frozen. As they dragged Preston and a screaming Lydia out of the room, Preston looked back at the old man standing by the window. "Who are you really?" Preston shouted, desperation breaking his voice. Winston turned his head slightly, just enough for Preston to see the cold smile. "I'm the gardener," Winston said, "and I just took out the trash." The fall of Preston Caldwell was swift and brutal. It was the kind of scandal that dominated the news cycle for weeks. The video of the hospital room was leaked, mysteriously, to every major news outlet. The hashtag #NotJusticeForSophie trended globally. Caldwell and Kurzer collapsed within 48 hours. Winston Mercer bought the assets for a fraction of their value, folded them into his massive conglomerate, Mercer Industries, and fired every executive who had ever looked down on his daughter. But Winston didn't care about the business. He spent his days in the ICU, sitting in the uncomfortable chair next to Sophie's bed, reading to her. He read her favorite books from childhood. He told her about her daughter, whom the nurses had nicknamed Miracle. The baby was healthy, feisty, and had Sophie's eyes. 3 weeks passed. The doctors were pessimistic. They talked about diminished brain activity and long-term care facilities. Winston fired those doctors and flew in specialists from Switzerland and Japan. "Wake up, Soph," Winston whispered, one rainy Tuesday afternoon. "You have to see what I did. I burned it all down for you. But it doesn't matter if you aren't here." He held her hand, his head bowed in prayer. Then he felt it. A twitch. Winston's head snapped up. Sophie's eyelids fluttered. The heart monitor picked up a faster rhythm. "Sophie?" Her eyes opened. They were glassy and unfocused at first, roaming the ceiling. Then they found Winston's face. "Dad!" she rasped. Her voice was like sandpaper. Winston wept. The man who had crushed a corporation without blinking broke down in tears. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." "The baby," Sophie whispered. "Is she? She's perfect," Winston choked out. "She's beautiful. She's waiting for you." Sophie tried to sit up but winced. Her memory was coming back in fragments. The pain, the fear. "Preston." "Lydia." "Preston," she said, her face hardening. He let her." "Shh," Winston soothed her, stroking her hair. "He's gone, Sophie. He's in jail. He can't hurt you, ever again." "He took everything," Sophie cried softly. "The house, the accounts." "He took nothing." Winston smiled, a mischievous glint returning to his eyes. "In fact, you took everything from him. You own his company now." "Well, we do." Sophie looked at her father, confused. "We? Dad, we can't afford." "There's something I need to tell you, Soph," Winston sighed, taking her hand in both of his. "I haven't been entirely honest with you about my job." Sophie blinked. "You're a gardener." "I was," Winston said, 40 years ago. Then I started a landscaping company, then a real estate firm. Then, well, things got out of hand. I'm worth about $40 billion, give or take." Sophie stared at him. The silence stretched for a long minute. "You're... what?" "I wanted you to be normal," Winston apologized. "I didn't want you to grow up like those spoiled rich kids who do nothing but shop and party. I wanted you to have character. So I hid it." Sophie started to laugh. It hurt her chest, but she couldn't stop. Tears streamed down her face. "You're a billionaire? And you let me drive that rusty Honda Civic for 5 years?" "It built character," Winston defended himself, grinning. "Is that why you bought the hospital?" Sophie asked, looking around the renovated suite, noticing the fresh orchids and the silk sheets. "I might have," Winston admitted. "And the police station where Preston is being held. I made a donation to ensure the air conditioning in his cell. Malfunctions." Sophie squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Dad." "Don't thank me yet," Winston said, his face turning serious. "The war isn't over. Preston is out on bail. His lawyer's a snake oil salesman, trying to get the video thrown out on a technicality. They say it was an illegal recording." Sophie's eyes narrowed. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold fire that matched her father's. "He's out? For now. The trial is next month." Sophie tried to push herself up again. This time she ignored the pain. "Get me a wheelchair," Sophie said. "Sophie, you need to rest." "Get me a wheelchair, Dad," she repeated, "and bring me my daughter. And then, bring me a lawyer. I'm not going to let you fight all my battles. I'm a mercer, aren't I?" Winston beamed with pride. Yes, you are." The day of the trial, the steps of the Supreme Court looked more like a red carpet event for a twisted movie premiere than a legal proceeding. Vans with satellite dishes lined the streets, and reporters jostled for position behind barricades. The public had been fed a steady diet of rumors for weeks. Was the video fake? Was the billionaire framed? Was the gardener really a secret tycoon? Inside the courtroom was a pressure cooker. The air conditioning hummed, struggling to cool the packed gallery. Preston sat at the defense table. He looked well-rested, wearing a light grey suit designed to make him look approachable, softer. Beside him sat his lawyer, Arthur Pike. Pike was known in legal circles as the Viper. He cost $5,000 an hour, and he had never lost a high-profile case. His strategy was always the same: confuse, delay, and destroy the victim's character. In the front row of the gallery sat Winston Mercer. He sat alone, his posture rigid. He wore black, looking like a grim reaper waiting to collect a soul. The seat next to him was empty. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Holloway, a stern woman with zero tolerance for theatrics, swept in and took her seat. "Be seated. This is the case of the State versus Preston Caldwell and Lydia Hart. Charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud." Lydia sat at a separate table with a public defender. She looked haggard, her roots showing, stripped of her designer clothes and makeup. Preston refused to look at her. District Attorney Miller, a sharp, young prosecutor, stood up. "Your Honor, the state will prove that Preston Caldwell and his mistress, Lydia Hart, conspired to murder Sophie Caldwell during her most vulnerable moment, childbirth. We have video evidence. We have motive, a prenuptial agreement that would have transferred millions to Mr. Caldwell upon his wife's death." "Objection," Pike drawled, standing up slowly. He didn't look at the judge. He smiled at the jury. "The prosecution is relying on a video that has no audio, obtained from a hidden camera installed illegally by a third party, Mr. Mercer, who had a financial interest in destroying my client's company." "Overruled," Judge Holloway said. "The video has been admitted." Pike nodded, unbothered. He knew the video was damning. His plan wasn't to deny the video existed. His plan was to rewrite what it meant. The trial dragged on for hours. The prosecution called the nurses, who testified to the valve being off. They called Dr. Orris, who sweat profusely, and admitted he had been pressured to lie about the equipment malfunction, though he stopped short of implicating Preston directly, fearing for his own license. Then it was Pike's turn. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Pike began, pacing in front of them. "You saw a video of a hand turning a valve. Yes, Ms. Hart turned the valve. But why?" He stopped and pointed at the empty seat next to Winston. "Sophie Caldwell had a history of instability," Pike lied smoothly. "Postpartum depression can start even before birth. We have witness testimony stating that Sophie begged for the pain to end. She was hysterical. Mr. Caldwell, in his shock and grief, was trying to manage a chaotic situation. He didn't order the oxygen cut. He was frozen in panic." "Lies!" Winston shouted from the gallery. "Order!" Judge Holloway banged her gavel. "Mr. Mercer, one more outburst and you will be removed." Pike smiled. He was baiting Winston. He wanted the jury to see an angry, vengeful father. "Furthermore," Pike continued, pulling out a document, "we have a sworn affidavit from a psychologist suggesting Mrs. Caldwell suffered from delusions. My client is not a murderer. He is a victim of a tragic medical misunderstanding, and a father-in-law who used that tragedy to execute a hostile corporate takeover. The jury looked at each other. Pike was good. He was planting doubt. Was Preston just a bad husband or a murderer? Being a jerk isn't a crime, their faces seemed to say. Suddenly, the double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The murmur of the crowd turned into a gasp. A bailiff pushed a wheelchair into the center aisle. Sitting in it was Sophie. She wore a simple white dress. She looked pale, and there was an oxygen tube still hooked under her nose, connected to a portable tank on her lap. But her eyes were clear. Pike stopped pacing. He hadn't expected her. The medical report said she would be bedridden for months. Winston stood up and walked to the aisle, taking the handles of the wheelchair from the bailiff. He wheeled his daughter through the gate and parked her right next to the prosecutor's table. Sophie stared directly at Preston. For the first time all day, Preston's confident mask cracked. He shifted in his seat, tugging at his collar. "Your Honor," D.A. Miller said, "the state calls Sophie Caldwell to the stand." Pike jumped up. "Objection! The witness is medically unfit. This is a stunt to garner sympathy." "I can speak," Sophie said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried to the back of the room. "And I want to testify." Judge Halloway looked at Sophie, then at Pike. "Overruled. Take the stand, Mrs. Caldwell." Winston helped her into the witness box. The examination was brutal. Pike attacked her immediately on cross-examination. "Mrs. Caldwell," Pike said, leaning on the railing, "is it true you told your husband you couldn't take it any more during labor?" "I was in pain," Sophie said. "I asked for help. I didn't ask to be suffocated." "But you were confused, weren't you? The drugs, the exhaustion. Can you be 100% certain that what you think you saw wasn't a hallucination induced by hypoxia?" "I saw him," Sophie said, her voice shaking slightly. "I saw him look at his watch. I saw him smile when the air stopped." "You saw a smile?" Pike scoffed. "Or did you see a grimace of concern? Memory is a tricky thing, Sophie, especially when your father has spent the last month whispering poison in your ear while you recovered." Pike turned to the jury. "She's a puppet, ladies and gentlemen. A puppet for a billionaire who wants to own the city." Preston smirked. He thought he had won. The he said, she said argument was working. Without audio, it was just interpretation. Sophie looked down at her hands. She took a deep breath. "You're right," Sophie said softly. The courtroom went silent. Pike froze. "Excuse me?" "You're right," Sophie said, looking up. "Memory is tricky, and video without audio can be misinterpreted." She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, black device. It looked like a USB drive. "That's why I didn't rely on memory." Pike's eyes widened. "What is that?" "My husband loves technology," Sophie said, her voice gaining strength. "He insisted our home be a smart home, everything connected, even our phones. He synced my phone to his cloud so he could track my location. He called it safety. I called it control." Sophie held up the drive. "But he forgot one thing. When he synced our accounts, it went both ways. I had access to his voice memos. And Preston, he loves the sound of his own voice. He records his brilliant ideas all day." Sophie looked at the judge. "Your Honor, this is a voice memo recorded on Preston Caldwell's phone at 9:15 a.m. on the day of my labor, time-stamped and geolocated to the hospital hallway, 5 minutes before he entered my room." "Objection!" Pike screamed. "Inadmissible! Surprise evidence!" "I just found it this morning," Sophie said calmly. "It goes to the motive." Judge Halloway adjusted her glasses. "I'll allow it. Play it." D.A. Miller took the drive and plugged it into the court's AV system. The static hissed for a second. Then Preston's voice filled the room. Loud, clear, arrogant. Memo to self, post-birth strategy. If Sophie doesn't survive the complications, contact legal immediately to trigger the prenup clause regarding widower status. Total asset retention. Tell Lydia to keep her mouth shut and just do what needs to be done. It's a simple twist of a valve. No one looks at the gardener's daughter and sees a survivor. Make sure to cry at the funeral. Wear the black Armani. The recording clicked off. The silence in the courtroom was heavier than lead. You could hear a pin drop. Preston wasn't smirking anymore. His face was grey. He slumped in his chair, looking like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Pike closed his eyes and sat down, burying his face in his hands. He knew it was over. Lydia, at her table, suddenly started laughing. It was a manic, hysterical sound. "I told you," she screamed at Preston. "I told you he was recording everything, you narcissist." "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Holloway said, her voice dripping with disgust. "Sit down." Preston tried to stand up. "It's a deep fake. It's AI. Winston made it." "Sit down," the bailiff barked, forcing him back into the chair. Sophie looked at Preston from the stand. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked done. "You underestimated the gardener," Sophie said into the microphone. "And you underestimated the gardener's daughter." The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. It wasn't just quiet. It was the heavy, dense stillness of 100 people holding their breath at once. The air conditioner hummed a low, monotonous drone, sounding like a countdown. Preston Caldwell sat at the defense table, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles were white. He stared at the jury box, trying to make eye contact, trying to use the charm that had won him millions in the boardroom. But the 12 men and women refused to look at him. They stared at their laps, at the floor, or at the judge. That was when Preston knew. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Holloway asked, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The foreman, a middle-aged school teacher who had looked terrified throughout the trial, stood up. He held a piece of paper that trembled slightly in his grip. "We have, Your Honor." Sophie sat in the front row, her wheelchair gone, replaced by a simple, upright chair. She held her father's hand. Winston's grip was warm, rough, and steady, an anchor in the storm. "In the matter of the state versus Preston Caldwell," the foreman began, his voice gaining strength, "on the count of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." Preston flinched as if he had been physically struck. A gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by a sharp hush. "On the count of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty." "On the count of insurance fraud, guilty." The word hung in the air, repeating like a drumbeat of doom. "Guilty, guilty, guilty." Preston's high-priced lawyer, Arthur Pike, closed his eyes and slowly began packing his briefcase. He didn't offer a hand of comfort to his client. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. Judge Holloway turned her gaze toward Preston. It was not a look of pity. It was a look of absolute disdain. "Preston Caldwell," she said, removing her reading glasses. "You were given every advantage in life. Wealth, education, status. You had a wife who loved you and a child on the way. Yet, in your greed, you treated them not as family, but as disposable assets. You viewed human life as a line item on a ledger." Preston tried to stand, his mouth opening to protest, to offer one last excuse, but his throat was dry. No words came out. "This court finds your actions not only criminal but morally bankrupt," Judge Holloway continued. "I am sentencing you to 30 years in a maximum security federal prison. You will not be eligible for parole for 25 years. 30 years. The number echoed in Preston's mind. He would be an old man if he survived. "And regarding Ms. Hart," the judge said, glancing at the sobbing woman at the co-defendant's table. "In light of your cooperation and testimony regarding Mr. Caldwell's financial schemes, your sentence is reduced to 15 years. As the gavel banged, a final wooden thunderclap, 2 bailiffs moved in. They didn't treat Preston like a CEO. They grabbed his arms roughly, pulling him from his chair. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound far louder than the camera shutters clicking in the back of the room. As they dragged him toward the side door, Preston looked back. He didn't look at the press. He looked at the gallery. He met Winston's eyes. The old gardener didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded, a slow, solemn gesture of closure. It was the look of a man who had finished a long, hard day's work. Then, the door closed, and Preston Caldwell was gone. 6 months later, the golden hour sun bathed the sprawling estate in a warm, amber glow. The property, once a cold monument to Preston's ego, had softened. The sharp, modern hedges were growing wilder, blooming with colour. The silence of the house had been replaced by the soft cooing of a baby. Sophie Mercer sat on the wide stone veranda, a cup of tea steaming on the table beside her. In her arms lay baby Hope, now 6 months old, with chubby cheeks and bright, curious eyes that mirrored her mother's. Sophie looked different. The shadows under her eyes were gone. She wore a tailored cream suit, looking every bit the powerful executive she had become. She had taken the reins of the charitable arm of Mercer Industries, turning her pain into purpose. She spent her days funding legal defense for women trapped in abusive marriages, ensuring no one else would ever feel as helpless as she had in that hospital bed. A low rumble interrupted the quiet. Sophie smiled as she watched a battered, rusted pickup truck chug up the pristine driveway. It looked comically out of place next to the manicured lawns and marble fountains. The truck shuddered to a halt, and Winston hopped out. He was wearing his favorite flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal his weathered forearms, and his old, mud-caked boots. "Dad?" Sophie laughed, shifting Hope to her hip as she walked down the steps to meet him. "You know you own a fleet of Bentleys, right? You're the chairman of the board. You can afford a car that has air conditioning." "This truck runs just fine," Winston said, grabbing a shovel and a pair of shears from the truck bed. He walked over and kissed Sophie on the cheek, then tickled Hope's belly, earning a delighted squeal from the baby. "Besides, luxury makes you soft. That truck keeps me humble." "You have a meeting with the governor in 3 hours," Sophie reminded him. "Plenty of time," Winston said, turning toward the garden beds near the gate. "But look at these hydrangeas, Soph. They're thirsty. If you don't tend to the roots, the flowers die. Doesn't matter how expensive the pot is." Sophie watched him work. He dug into the earth with the same focus he used to dismantle corporations. It was a grounding sight. "You know," Winston said, leaning on his shovel and looking up at the massive house behind her, "money is a funny thing. It reveals who you really are. For Preston, it was a mask. It made him a monster because he was empty inside. But for you..." He looked at his daughter, strong, kind, and resilient. "For you, it's just a tool. It didn't change you, Sophie. It just gave you a bigger shovel." Sophie felt a lump in her throat. She looked down at Hope, who was grasping her finger with a tiny iron grip. "I was so scared, Dad," she whispered. "When I woke up, I didn't think I could do this." "But you did," Winston said firmly. "We're Mercers. We don't run from the storm. We stand in the rain until it passes, and then we replant." Sophie smiled, the last lingering weight of the past finally lifting from her shoulders. "We represent the storm," she corrected him softly, echoing his words from months ago. Winston grinned, his blue eyes twinkling. "That's my girl." He went back to digging, the rhythmic sound of the shovel hitting the earth filling the air. Sophie turned back to the sunset, holding her daughter close. She had a company to run, a child to raise, and a life to live. And if anyone ever mistook her kindness for weakness again, they would learn the hard way: never mess with the flower, or you'll get the thorns. This story reminds us that true strength isn't about the money in your bank account or the suit on your back. It's about the integrity in your heart. Preston thought he was untouchable because of his wealth, but he forgot that the tallest towers crumble the hardest. Sophie and Winston showed that patience and love are the ultimate weapons against greed. If you enjoyed this story of justice and karma, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. What would you do if you were in Sophie's shoes? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.